If you're wondering, why can't I improvise well? I've got your answer right here. When people first try to improvise on guitar, usually the results are disappointing. And a lot of times people come away thinking, well, I guess I'm just, not talented enough or not creative enough or whatever. I just don't get it. But in fact, improvisation is a skill. Like any other skill, you can develop it, but you got to know the right way to go about doing it. There are 4 separate components, and we're going to look at them. Here's number 1. We learn a scale and it looks like a dot pattern on the neck, and that's fine for learning where your fingers go. But now you want to take that scale and start improvising. So you want to turn it into music. You see all the dot patterns, you think, well, those are the notes in the key, so they should all work. So let's play this one, and then maybe this one, that one, and you're sort of picking them haphazardly at random. And so it should be no surprise that what you're playing sounds haphazard and random. There's no purpose, there's no structure to it. When we're going to improvise a lick or a melody, we're playing in a certain context, which means we're playing over a chord. Now, that chord might be there, directly, or it might be implied from the context, but in any case, we're playing in a certain context, a certain what we call harmonic context, which means we're over a certain chord. Now, some of the notes that are in your scale are in the chord that you're soloing over. Those notes are called chord tones. And then the notes that are in the scale that are not in the chord, they're called non-chord tones. Okay, so big deal. Chord tones and non-chord tones, what's the significance of that? The significance is that notes that are chord tones are going to sound strong and stable, and they're going to be the gravitation points that your melody notes want to move toward. And the notes that are the non-chord tones, these are unstable or they're dissonant over that chord, so they're going to be uncomfortable staying there. They're going to want to move. And this action of moving from dissonance to consonance, moving from unstable to stable, is the thing that gives melody its purpose and direction. Now, you might say, well, I don't really care that much about melody. I just want to play solos. I want to play licks. I want to play fast. Well, okay, in that case, go ahead and learn a couple dozen licks and then recycle the pieces of those licks, and you can improvise. That'll work for short solo breaks, 8 measures, 16 measure solo inside a song, because you play a couple of licks, you move through this register, that register, and you're done. But that approach always winds up making every solo pretty much sound the same. You run out of ideas at some point and you start getting bored. It also means, by the way, that you can't really solo for an extended time without boring everybody. And I'm not just talking about the listener. What about boring yourself? The key to making your licks sound more interesting and being able to sustain interest longer term is having a melodic sense. The same rules that make melody work will also make your licks sound more melodic and purposeful. So let's go ahead and dig in a little deeper. Let's take a short example and dig into this. You might recognize this little melody. That's in the key of D major, and we're over the pedal tone D, the root here is the open D string. Now, let's look first at this note. That's also a D, so it's our root, it's our tonic note. The distance from the low root up to the octave root is, of course, an octave, and it's probably the most stable interval you can get. It almost sounds naked. Then the next step of the scale here is E. This is the second. Now, if I play that over the D, now you hear turbulence, some dissonance in the sound. Let's keep going. The next one is the third note here. Now, when I get to the third and I play that over the root, it's rich and kind of has a color to it, so it doesn't sound like the root, but it is similar to the root in the sense that it feels like it's at rest. Here, we're good. We don't have to move. And here, we can sit there too. That's comfortable. By contrast, the second is kind of turbulent and kind of unsettled, so it wants to move like this. Or here. Either way is fine, but it probably doesn't naturally just kind of want to sit there. Now, let's go back and look at that tune. It starts on the second, so it hits this dissonance, and then we quickly shift up and land on the third. In classical music, classical guitar, that's called an appoggiatura, and it means we're going to play a chord, and then on top of that chord, we're going to play a melody note that is a non-chord tone, that dissonance, but we're going to quickly resolve it to a nearby chord tone. Now, let me ask you a question. How long can we sustain that dissonance before we resolve it? 2 beats? Sure, why not? How about 4? No problem. In fact, we can hold that dissonance really as long as we want to. There's no law that says we must resolve. But here's the thing. If you understand that it wants to resolve, you can play with that. You can give it the resolution if you want, but you can also hold off on the resolution. If I hit that second and I just sustain it, now it's going to create what we call a suspension. And here's the thing, all of us listeners have, by a lifetime of listening to music and hearing melody, resolutions and suspensions, we have learned, the collective ear sort of everybody has kind of learned that these motions are involved, that these motions towards stability are unconsciously creating what we perceive as direction and purpose in a melody. Okay, so whether we understand what's happening or not, the point is we kind of notice it, and that's how we'll know. If we hear a melody that sounds strong, it's because it's using these principles of resolution. And if we hear a melody that just sounds bad, like you pick notes at random and they just don't make any sense, well, the reason they don't make any sense is because they're not paying attention to this underlying unconscious need to have some kind of sense of resolution in our melodies. Now let's keep going. After the appoggiatura, back to dissonance, and that dissonance is on its way down. So we're up on the third, and we've reached the third by decorating it, by hitting 2 and then rising into 3, and then we're going to fall from 3, 2, 1. Now that fall, 3, 2, 1, moves from consonance to dissonance, consonance. And that's a good way to go, because if we just stuck with consonances all the time, it would get really boring. You need a little bit of play or interplay between, the strong and the off the strong. It's the interplay of light and dark to keep things interesting. So that motion down to 2 it makes sense to our ears because, you hear a moment of instability, but, you give me a reason to move through it, and now I resolve again, and now it's all good. So in this case, we'd call that second a passing tone. Its function is to link between 3 to 1 to make the transition more melodic, more stepwise. Now, how does all that melody stuff relate to improvisation? Well, at the beginning, remember I said most players, they learn a scale, and then they're going at the notes kind of haphazardly, wondering what they're going to sound like, and then they hit a note and think it sounds bad. What's actually happening is that they don't realize that the note that they just hit is a non-chord tone, and it's going to hang. It's not going to resolve. It's about expectation then. If you know what the note's going to sound like, you might hit a non-chord tone, a suspension, and hold it intentionally, and it'll be fine. But if you're expecting to hear something that sounds resolved, and you play a note and it sounds unresolved, it's going to throw you, it's going to catch you off guard. So what it really boils down to is learning where the gravitation points are as you play. You should also realize that if you're on a non-chord tone, you're only one scale step away from a strong note, from a chord tone. Step 2 was a non-chord tone. Well, you could drop to 1, that's strong, you could go up to 3. 3 is a strong note. 4 is a non-chord tone. You could drop to 3 or you could rise to 5. 6, a non-chord tone. You could drop to 5. 7, non-chord tone. You could rise to the octave. So in any case, you're always really close to notes that do sound stable and resolved. If you hit one that's not, and you know your scale, well, then you can sort of correct yourself. Of course, the better solution is to connect your inner ear to the fretboard so that as you imagine a melody in your mind, you know what it looks like on the fretboard, and your fingers play those notes, and they sound exactly like what you're expecting. When you get to that point, then you can pretty much improvise, seat of your pants, and everything's always going to sound great. But the first step is really just to understand this differentiation between the gravitation points, the chord tones, and the non-chord tones, and how they want to move. Not saying that you have to move them, but understanding then that the gravitation points, these are the more important points. It's like this is the skeleton, and then these non-chord tones can sort of hang on those more important notes and decorate them. And now you're starting to see how melody really works. And that means you can begin to listen for this as well as experiment with it as you improvise. And what that means, practically speaking, is that's the arpeggio of the chord you're over superimposed against the scale. And that's what divides chord tones from non-chord tones. Look at your arpeggios. That's the first step toward playing melodically, toward understanding how the notes of a scale aren't dot patterns, but actually are musical tones, and you can actually start to use them. In the next video in this series, I'm going to go into rhythm and phrasing and show you how that plays a key role in the ability to improvise. Be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. I'll see you in the next video.